Carl, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Your Royal Holiness, Eminences, it's a pleasure to join you again. And I think what I'm primarily going to do is to try to make explicit some things which a number of the earlier speakers have told you, but unless you're immersed in this stuff, the dots may not get easily connected, because you've heard some very, very important things from the other speakers. And I want to begin with the general premise. With trivial exceptions, every human community is absolutely dependent for its survival and its safety on the interplay of connected hydrologic systems. Let's look at New Orleans. Why is New Orleans here? What is Louisiana actually? It's the former tops of the Appalachians and the Rockies. How did the Appalachians and the Rockies get here? Because the rivers brought them. Why did they stop here? Because the Gulf of Mexico pushed them back. So the location of this city was determined by the interplay between river and sea. And either of those hydrological systems, if it took a mind to it, could wipe the whole thing out. They are simply much, much bigger, and as the general said, eventually they will do what they will do. That is, I think, an unassailable fact. I'm going to now draw what I think is actually an unassailable conclusion, but it's an unassailable conclusion that we don't think about. Our safety and security depends upon providing those dynamic hydrologic systems with enough connected space so that they can continue to keep us safe. If we try to squeeze out, or if we break the connections, all the engineering in the world will not keep us safe. In an era of stable climate, human beings learn that lesson fairly easily, because if they mess it up, they get washed away. The British, briefly in the 1840s, moved the city of Calcutta from its present location, and they moved it down the Hooghly River to an island much closer to the open Arabian Sea. Those voices who protested that that would remove Calcutta, that would take Calcutta out in front of its mangrove barrier, which protected it from typhoons, were ignored. And for 7 years, the British Raj sat on the edge of the Bay of Bengal, and at the end of 7 years, the typhoon came. And the Raj scuttled back to Calcutta behind the mangroves. In Afghanistan, the great city of Balkh, where Alexander the Great married his Roxanne, no longer exists, because the river, which was the reason for Balkh's location, decided to move. So for most of human history, we learned these lessons by making mistakes. But once we learned them, we were dealing with a stable climate. So we could take the lessons we'd learned, we could build a city, we could build New Orleans, and we could say this is in a good location. It's on the high ground, it's where the interplay between the Gulf and the river enables us to create a city and to have navigation. But that was all based on the idea that climate is a constant. Well, we can't count on that idea anymore, so that's problem one. And I'm going to argue that in an era of chaotic climate, we have to provide natural hydrologic systems not only with adequate space and connection, but with generous space and connection. because we're actually asking them to do more for us than they historically did. The wetlands, which used to be south of this city, are degrading because we broke the connection. Franklin Roosevelt built dams at Fort Peck on the Missouri River, and you heard that 50% of the sediment that used to nourish South Louisiana doesn't get here anymore. Incidentally, when it stopped behind Fort Peck, it has other consequences. That dam system now produces only 40% as much electric power as it was designed to do, and eventually it will produce very, very little. So this breaking of connections is very problematic. So is trying to limit the play of natural systems. I thought the general's figure about what would have happened if we had built all of the dikes that people might want on the upper Mississippi is a very telling one. When the Mississippi floods these days, it doesn't necessarily mean we're having an extraordinary amount of rainfall. The river is now rather like a human being with serious atherosclerosis. Its arteries are clogged. We really need to not build levees. We're going to need levees. But we need to open up the levees. We need to recognize that the river needs more natural space in which to operate. And as the general said, for human communities which have located themselves on the assumption that the river only needed this much space, an era in which the river needs this much space is going to be a challenge. If we don't do that, what's going to happen to New Orleans? Or even if we do that, because there is another reality you heard. You heard from Gerald that at flood, of the 3 million, was it, what was 3 million acre feet?
Cubic feet per second.
3 million cubic feet per second that flow down the Mississippi. What we think of as the main stem of the Mississippi, which is out this window, can only handle 1 million. The Mississippi doesn't really want to be here anymore. This is not really the natural flow of the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River now wants to get to the Gulf where the Atchafalaya is. And the Army Corps of Engineers has built enormous facilities at New River to try to encourage the Mississippi to stay where it no longer wants to be. But I'm going to suggest that, as the general says, eventually the river will do what the river will do. And that, in fact, New Orleans as a port on the main stem of the Mississippi is not a permanent feature of the American landscape, because this will not be the permanent outlet of the Mississippi River, however hard we try. So what does all this mean? What is the nature of this story? And I think there are 3 stories that you can tell from Katrina. And I think we are making a mistake by only telling 2 of them. The first story is that Katrina is a story of failed engineering, poor evacuation planning, the incompetence of an American administration, the fact that we have a deeply divided society and an unjust society racially and economically. That's one story of Katrina. It's a particularly American story. But in the month of August 2005, New Orleans was not the only place where more than 1,000 people died in a flood. I was actually in Mumbai, India, the day after 36 inches of rain fell in 12 hours on the northern part of the city. And more people drowned in Mumbai that day than actually died in Katrina. And if you looked at why that happened, the story was not so different. Huge numbers of people had encroached on the mangroves, which were historically the drainage system which carried water out of Mumbai and into the Arabian Sea. There had been encroachment on this drainage system. It had been clogged with plastic bags, actually. But the bottom line when they looked at the problem afterwards was that if you wanted to make Mumbai safe, you had to give Mumbai's hydrologic systems more space. And that's very challenging in an urban conglomeration of 18 million people, most of whom don't have deeded property. So one of the lessons that I think we need to take away from what happened both here in New Orleans and in Mumbai is we need to find a way to provide more space for natural systems to keep us safe. If we try to use engineering to cheat nature of space, nature will not be able to do what we depend on nature to do. And short of direct divine intervention on a case-by-case basis, we are going to be in a world of hurt. And the third lesson that I think we need to draw from Katrina is that because we find it very difficult to give natural systems even enough space with today's climate. The idea, the glib idea that we can continue to permit the destabilization of the climate and that we will somehow engineer our way to adapt to that is simply arrogant. There is actually no evidence, whether it's from what happened in Balkh 500 years ago, whether it's from what happened on the Persian Gulf and the Bay of Bengal in 1847, from what happened in Mumbai and here in New Orleans in 2005. There is no evidence that we have the capacity to re-engineer our communities fast enough to handle dramatically less stable climate. It is hard enough to build a safe city for a climate you can predict. It is phenomenally difficult to engineer a city for a climate which is becoming steadily more chaotic. So I think there are three lessons from Katrina, one which is specific to the United States. We better get our act together, and I think the General's working on that. The second is, everywhere in the world we need to start giving space back to natural hydrologic systems. And the third is, we should not fool ourselves that we are wise enough or powerful enough to handle a chaotic climate. Thank you.